The English model crossed the Atlantic with colonization and after a contentious century-long debate was institutionalized in the United States with the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The Fed is a quasi-private institution. It is formally a creature of federal statute, but its 12 regional banks are owned by member commercial banks, and its governance structure gives significant influence to private financial interests. In the same year the Federal Reserve was established, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting Congress the explicit power to levy a federal income tax, and the Internal Revenue Service was formalized as the collection agency. These two developments, the central bank and the income tax, together defined the financial architecture of the modern American state. The government would fund itself through taxation and debt. The debt would be serviced through the financial system, and the financial system would be regulated by the government whose operations it financed. This circular relationship created structural incentives for the government to accommodate the interests of financial capital, since alienating those interests would raise the cost of sovereign borrowing. The financial industrial complex arm allowed for the expansion of this mechanism, affording the U.S. global control by way of the Bretton Woods Conference, which led to the creation of two new institutions: the International Monetary Fund, which would monitor exchange rates and lend reserve currencies to nations with balance of payments deficits, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now known as the World Bank, which was responsible for providing financial assistance for the reconstruction of war-torn countries and the economic development of less developed nations. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank present themselves to the world as neutral development institutions, technocratic bodies staffed by economists whose mission is to promote global prosperity, reduce poverty, and stabilize volatile currencies. The official narrative is generous and humanitarian. The structural reality is considerably more complex. Both institutions are governed by weighted voting systems that directly reflect the economic power of their member states. The United States holds the largest single voting share in both the IMF and the World Bank, and uniquely possesses an effective veto over major decisions since those decisions require supermajority approval. The president of the World Bank has, by convention since the institution's founding, always been an American. The managing director of the IMF has, by parallel convention, always been a European. These are not accidents of history. They are the structural expression of the post-war power settlement in which the United States and its principal allies designed institutions to serve an international order in which they would remain dominant. In practice, both institutions can force subjugation of foreign countries by requiring the installation of a Western central bank and the privatization of national resources, which allows the country to be managed as an asset. The 20th century added another critical layer to this architecture, which spawned from what President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his 1961 farewell address called the military-industrial complex, the system's global enforcement mechanism. Eisenhower's warning was analytically precise. The Cold War had created, for the first time in American history, a permanent military establishment that required continuous large-scale procurement of weapons systems, logistics infrastructure, and advanced technology from private contractors. This created a class of corporations and an entire ecosystem of subcontractors, research universities, think tanks, and lobbying organizations that were structurally dependent on federal military spending and therefore deeply invested in maintaining the political conditions that sustained it. The technological industrial complex that grew from this foundation, encompassing defense, aerospace, telecommunications, and eventually digital technology, represents one of the most significant transfers of public capital to private corporations in history, and one of the primary mechanisms through which the post-World War II wealth of the United States was concentrated in corporate hands. Digital technology platforms are simultaneously defense infrastructure, commercial infrastructure, communications infrastructure, and crucially, surveillance infrastructure. The data these platforms collect is not merely commercially valuable. It is an instrument of governance. When a government can monitor its citizens' communications, track their physical movements, analyze their social networks, and model their psychological profiles, all through the data generated by their use of ostensibly commercial services. The distinction between the private economy and the state apparatus of control becomes, in practice, very thin. The dominant narrative of Silicon Valley innovation obscures the structural role of military funding, intelligence agency partnerships, and venture capital networks in determining which innovations achieve market dominance. The same dynamic operates at the global level. American technology platforms, Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, now provide the foundational digital infrastructure for billions of people in virtually every country on Earth. The communications networks, cloud computing systems, financial technology platforms, and search and information architectures that underpin daily economic and social life in most of the world are overwhelmingly American-owned and American-operated. This is not the result of superior consumer preference alone. It reflects decades of strategic public investment in the underlying technologies, the structural advantages of operating in the world's largest single currency market, the network effects that make dominant platforms nearly impossible to dislodge once established, and critically, the absence of equivalent public investment in alternative digital infrastructure in most other countries. The geopolitical implications are substantial. A nation whose citizens rely on American platforms for communication, whose government relies on American cloud infrastructure for data storage and processing, and whose financial system depends on American-controlled payment networks, is not fully sovereign in any meaningful economic sense. It is integrated into the American financial technological order in ways that create dependencies structurally analogous to the dollar global reserve currency dependencies created by the Bretton Woods system and the petrodollar arrangement. The form of control has modernized, the underlying logic has not. By 2024, big tech's research and development investment reached $240 billion, more than a quarter of total R&D recorded in the United States. This concentration of innovative capacity in a handful of private corporations, whose leadership has become increasingly explicit about their relationship with government power, represents the maturation of the technological industrial complex into a genuinely systemic force. It is not a supplement to the integrated financial military corporate system. It is its newest and most powerful component. Viewed as an integrated system, the architecture looks like this. Private capital is organized through the corporate form, which provides limited liability and perpetual existence. Access to that capital is mediated by the banking system and the central bank, which set the terms on which credit is available and at what cost. The most privileged corporate actors, those large enough to be considered too big to fail, those with sufficient political influence to shape their own regulatory environment, gain access to the most favorable credit conditions and the most accommodating regulatory frameworks. The government, dependent on these same financial actors to finance its operations, structurally accommodates their interests in tax policy, regulatory design, and enforcement priorities. Public spending on defense, infrastructure, and research generates substantial returns for private contractors. And the entire system is backed, ultimately, by the enforcement capacity of the state, the military, the legal system, and the police power, which protects property rights and contract obligations that overwhelmingly favor those with the most property and the most favorable contracts. It is a coherent system. It is a durable system, and it is a system that has been remarkably successful at generating wealth in aggregate and at concentrating that wealth among a relatively small number of actors. The system we have described did not achieve its current form in isolation. It was built within a specific geopolitical context, the era of Western, and more specifically American, global economic dominance. The dollar's dominance isn't purely the result of free market preference. It was constructed through the post-war agreements, energy deals, legal tax obligations, economic scale, and military power, then maintained through institutional inertia and continued enforcement. No single pillar holds it up, they reinforce one another. The demand is artificial in origin, but it has become structural in practice. The Bretton Woods Agreement was the cornerstone agreement which created the foundation for U.S. global power. After World War II, 44 nations met in New Hampshire and agreed to peg their currencies to the U.S. dollar, which was itself pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. This made the dollar the world's reserve currency overnight. Every country needed dollars to conduct international trade and settle debts. Even after Nixon ended the gold peg in 1971, the dollar's dominance stuck. The infrastructure, banks, contracts, institutions, was already built around it. When the gold peg ended, the dollar needed a new anchor. The Nixon administration struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, which came to be known as the petrodollar. Oil would be priced and sold exclusively in US dollars, and in exchange, the US would provide military protection. Since every country on Earth needs oil, every country now needed dollars to buy it. This created a permanent, structural, global demand for the currency. Though the formal 50-year agreement reportedly expired in 2024, decades of dollar-denominated oil contracts, pricing conventions, and banking infrastructure don't vanish overnight. The system has enormous momentum. The United States is the world's largest or second largest, depending on measurement, economy. When nations trade globally, they tend to settle in the currency of the dominant economic power because it's liquid, stable, and widely accepted. Holding dollar reserves also means holding U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively lending money to the U.S. government at low interest. This gives America the extraordinary privilege of borrowing cheaply in its own currency, which in turn funds more spending, which sustains the economy, which reinforces why people want dollars. It's a self-reinforcing loop. Economist Stephanie Kelton, building on modern monetary theory, offers an underappreciated explanation for why citizens fundamentally need the dollar. The U.S. government requires taxes to be paid in dollars. This isn't just a convenience, it's a legal obligation backed by the state's coercive power. If you owe taxes in dollars, you must earn or obtain dollars, which means working, selling goods, or exchanging other assets for them. In this view, taxation isn't primarily about raising revenue for a government that issues its own currency. It's the mechanism that creates demand for that currency in the first place. The same logic scales internationally. Any country that trades with the U.S., services dollar-denominated debt, or holds dollar reserves is effectively pulled into the dollar system. The U.S. defense budget is larger than the next several countries combined. This massive investment funds an unmatched global military presence, naval carrier groups, hundreds of overseas bases, satellite systems, and the world's most advanced weapons. This military capacity underwrites the rules-based international order, trade routes, shipping lanes, and financial systems that all operate in dollars. The U.S. military is, in effect, the security guarantee behind the global financial system. Countries that benefit from that security have a strong reason not to undermine the dollar. This is the most contested pillar. Critics argue that U.S. military interventions, whether framed as spreading democracy, fighting terrorism, or protecting human rights, have often coincided with installing or preserving governments that keep their economies integrated into the dollar system. Iraq's Saddam Hussein had moved to price oil in euros before the 2003 invasion. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was proposing a Pan-African gold-backed currency before 2011. Whether these were direct causes of intervention is debated, but the pattern has led many analysts to argue that U.S. military force functions, at least in part, as a defender of dollar hegemony. Countries that try to exit the dollar system face diplomatic and sometimes military pressure. Since the end of World War II, the United States has occupied the center of the global economic system. The dollar has served as the world's primary reserve currency, the medium in which international trade is denominated, in which central banks hold their reserves, and in which the global financial system settles its obligations. This exorbitant privilege, as the French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously described it in the 1960s, has allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits and finance its public debt at lower interest rates than would otherwise be sustainable because global demand for dollars and dollar-denominated assets is structurally guaranteed. That's why, even as countries like China, Russia, and Gulf states discuss alternatives, yuan settlements, BRICS currencies, commodity-backed systems, displacing the dollar remains extraordinarily difficult. That context is now changing in ways that will have profound implications for the domestic political economy we have been analyzing. That arrangement is now under increasing stress. The rise of China as an economic power of roughly comparable scale to the United States, the growing economic integration of the global South outside of dollar-denominated frameworks, the emergence of alternative payment systems, and the exploration of digital currencies by central banks around the world, and the geopolitical fractures exposed by conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, have all accelerated a transition toward what analysts increasingly call a multipolar world, a global order in which American economic and geopolitical dominance is no longer uncontested. This transition has significant implications for the domestic economic arrangements we have examined. A world in which the dollar's reserve currency status is diminished is a world in which the United States has less latitude to run fiscal deficits, less capacity to export inflation, and less leverage to enforce the terms of global trade on its own preferred conditions. The financial and political costs of maintaining the current system, including the military expenditure required to enforce it, become harder to sustain, and the populations who bear those costs, without proportionally sharing in the benefits, become increasingly aware of the disparity. What this moment demands, therefore, is not merely criticism, but analysis of alternatives. The rules of the economic system were changed before, during the Progressive Era, during the New Deal, and during the post-war Reconstruction. They can be changed again. The empirical case for more robust antitrust enforcement, more equitable taxation, stronger labor protections, and more democratic governance of financial institutions is not weak. It is, in many respects, stronger than it has been at any point in the past half-century. The obstacle is not analytical, it is political. The concentrated economic power that has been built over the past 4 decades has also generated concentrated political power, and that power will be deployed to resist structural reform. Understanding the system, its history, its mechanics, and its consequences is the prerequisite for changing it. That is what this analysis has attempted to provide. The system is not a law of nature, it is a set of choices, and in a democratic society, choices can be revisited.